I stood in the hallway, the dim glow from her phone screen illuminating my clenched fist. My heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, as I stared at the message. "Can't wait to see you again, gorgeous." The words from our personal trainer, Lucas, stared back at me like a flashing neon sign. There was no misunderstanding about this. It was clear, undeniable proof. For a moment, I felt like the world was crumbling beneath my feet. Abby, my wife, the woman I had built my life with, was having an affair. The room felt too small, suffocating even. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of it. But as the shock faded, something colder, more deliberate, took its place. I wasn't going to explode in anger. No, that would be too easy. I needed a plan, something they wouldn't see coming. It hadn't always been like this. Abby and I used to be solid. We laughed, shared dreams, and talked about the future. Then, she started working out with Lucas, a young, muscular guy with that perfect, arrogant smile. At first, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her. But over the last few months, there have been subtle changes. Late nights at the gym, unexplained absences, the way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching. It wasn't just my imagination. I had begun to notice the little things. The way she'd linger around him after training sessions, the shared glances that lasted just a second too long. It all started making sense, and that text message was the final nail in the coffin. But it wasn't enough to just confront her with it. No, I needed to do more. I spent the next few weeks playing the part of the oblivious husband, all while gathering evidence. I watched them closely. Watched their interactions, their secretive smiles, their casual touches. I even managed to get access to her phone, unlocking a whole trove of secrets. Their messages were explicit, full of promises and plans to meet in hotels. Abby had hidden his number under a false name, Sarah, but it didn't take long for me to figure out who she was really talking to. I had everything I needed. Photos, screenshots, hotel reservations. It was time to act. The perfect opportunity presented itself when Abby suggested hosting a party at our house. She wanted to celebrate her birthday, and it was the ideal cover for what I had in mind. I agreed without hesitation, but my motives were far from innocent. This wasn't going to be just any party. This was going to be the night where the truth would come crashing down around her. I planned every detail meticulously. The guest list included all our closest friends, colleagues, and, of course, Lucas himself. He wouldn't suspect a thing. After all, he thought I was clueless. The thought of their smug satisfaction, believing they'd fooled me, only fueled my desire for revenge. As the night of the party approached, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in my head. I knew exactly how I would deliver my speech, how I would reveal their betrayal to the world. There would be no turning back once it started. When the evening arrived, everything was perfect. Guests filled our home, laughter and chatter echoing through the rooms. Abby was radiant, smiling and mingling with everyone, completely oblivious to what was coming. Lucas arrived shortly after, blending in with the crowd like the snake he was. I watched them both, my pulse steady, my resolve firm. It wasn't until the party was in full swing, everyone's attention focused on the joyous celebration, that I made my move. I raised my glass, signaling for everyone to quiet down. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice clear and unwavering. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. It means a lot to Abby and me." I looked around the room, locking eyes with her for a moment. She smiled back, clueless. "But tonight isn't just about a birthday celebration. There's something I need to share with all of you." The room fell silent. Abby's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "You see," I continued, "some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. And I think it's time that the truth comes out." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. With a few taps, the screen behind me lit up, displaying the first of many text messages between Abby and Lucas. I watched as the color drained from her face. The guests were frozen in their places, staring at the screen in disbelief. The silence was deafening. "This is Lucas," I said, my voice dripping with venom, "our personal trainer. And this," I gestured to the messages, "this is the woman I thought I knew." Abby's eyes were wide, her hand trembling as she reached for me. "Nate, I can explain." "No," I cut her off. "You've done enough." I felt nothing as the evidence piled up, text after text, photo after photo, each one painting a clearer picture of their betrayal. Lucas stood rooted to the spot, his smug demeanor gone, replaced by sheer panic. And in that moment, as their lies unraveled in front of everyone, I knew my plan had worked. Revenge, after all, is best served cold. The silence that followed my revelation was thicker than I expected. For a few moments, no one moved. They were frozen, staring at the messages flickering on the screen behind me. Abby stood in the middle of the room, her face pale as a ghost. Her eyes darted from me to the screen, and then to Lucas, who was still standing at the edge of the room, looking like a deer caught in headlights. I felt oddly calm, like I had already rehearsed this scene so many times that living it now was almost mundane. I wasn't trembling, I wasn't yelling, I was just delivering the truth. Piece by piece. Is this some kind of joke? A voice finally broke the silence, our neighbor Jess, eyes wide in disbelief. Nate, are you serious? Oh, it's very real, I replied, my voice cutting through the air like a knife. I tapped my phone again, displaying a screenshot of a hotel reservation made in Lucas's name. Abby's name was listed as the second guest. I think this makes it pretty clear. Here's the hotel they met at last week. Not the first time either. Murmurs spread through the room. Some people covering their mouths, others exchanging shocked glances. Abby took a shaky step forward, her voice breaking. Nate, please. Can we talk about this privately? I turned to face her fully. Privately? I echoed, letting the word hang in the air. You've already done plenty behind closed doors, Abby. I think it's time we opened them. Her lip trembled, her hands shaking. For a moment, I almost saw the woman I fell in love with, the vulnerability, the fear. But the betrayal overpowered any sympathy I might have had. She wasn't the same Abby anymore. She wasn't my Abby. Lucas, who had been trying to edge toward the exit, finally found his voice. Nate, man, let's not do this here. You're angry, and I get it, but this is a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I barked a short, humorless laugh. A misunderstanding is when you forget to take out the trash, Lucas. This, I gestured broadly at the room, is an affair. Plain and simple. Abby reached for me again, her voice low and pleading. I swear it wasn't like that. It was just a mistake, something that got out of hand. The words stung, but I didn't let them pierce the armor I'd built around myself. A mistake? I repeated. A mistake happens once, Abby. You've been lying to me for months. Don't insult me by calling it a slip-up. The room felt electric with tension now. People were whispering, phones were buzzing. No doubt the gossip had already started spreading beyond the walls of our home. That was exactly what I wanted. I hadn't just planned for this moment to be personal. It was meant to be public. Everyone needed to know. I looked around at the guests, watching their reactions. Some were avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. Others were practically glued to the drama, unable to tear themselves away. That was the thing about betrayal, it fascinated people. It was like watching a train wreck you couldn't stop. Abby's voice pulled me back to the moment. Nate, I'm begging you. Don't do this. We can fix it. We can. Fix it? I cut her off, my voice louder this time. How do you fix this, Abby? How do you fix months of lying, sneaking around, and cheating? You've humiliated me. You've made me feel like a fool in front of everyone. Lucas, finally stepping forward, tried again to interject. Let's just step outside, Nate. We can talk about this like men. I turned to him, my expression hardening. Like men? You're no man, Lucas. A real man doesn't sneak behind another's back. You're a coward. His face flushed red, and for a moment, I thought he might try to defend himself physically. But he didn't. He just stood there, fists clenched at his sides, unable to come up with anything that would save him from the mess he'd created. The weight of everything finally seemed to crush Abby. She dropped her head into her hands, sobbing softly. It was a sound I hadn't heard from her in years. I used to hate seeing her cry. Now, I didn't feel anything. It was like I had turned off whatever part of me once cared. I didn't want to do this, I said, my voice quieter but still firm. But you gave me no choice. I wasn't going to let you walk all over me while pretending nothing was wrong. You lied to me, to all of us. The guests were getting restless now. Some people quietly slipped toward the door, eager to escape the drama before it got even worse. But there was no escaping the damage. Abby's reputation, Lucas's career, our marriage, everything was laid bare. With one final look at the room, I tossed my phone onto the couch, leaving it open with all the messages, the photos, the proof of their affair. You can stay here and explain this to everyone, or you can leave. It doesn't matter to me anymore. I turned and started walking toward the front door, my body strangely light, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Behind me, I could hear Abby's desperate voice, trying to reach me one last time. "Nate, please, I love you." But it was too late for that. Whatever love had been between us was long gone. And with that, I walked out of my own house, leaving behind the wreckage that she and Lucas had created. I drove aimlessly for hours that night. The streets of the city blurred past me, glowing in the dim light of street lamps and neon signs. It was quiet in the car, too quiet. My phone buzzed on the seat next to me, vibrating with calls and messages. I didn't need to look to know who they were from. Abby had probably been blowing up my phone since I walked out, desperate to do damage control. Desperate to explain, but I wasn't interested in explanations. I pulled over by the pier, the one place I used to go when I needed to think. It felt like a lifetime ago since I'd been here, back when life was simpler, back when I thought my world was solid. The waves crashed against the rocks in a steady rhythm, giving me something to focus on that wasn't the chaos in my head. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. Just hours ago, I was surrounded by people, friends, colleagues, even Abby's lover, and now, standing on the edge of the water, I was completely alone. I hadn't thought about what would happen after the party. I'd been so focused on that one moment, on that big reveal, that I hadn't given any thought to the fallout. Now I was standing in the rubble, trying to figure out what the hell came next. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the ocean. The cold air whipped at my face, numbing me slightly, but not enough. Not enough to stop the constant flood of thoughts that circled around in my head. The memories, the betrayal, the lies, they all came back in sharp, painful flashes. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything. The months of deception, the nights I lay awake wondering where she was, the conversations where she had looked me in the eye and lied straight to my face. That was the part that stung me the most. The betrayal was bad enough, but it was the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. I ran my hand over my face, trying to shake the exhaustion that had settled into my bones. I knew what people were going to say. I knew the gossip was already spreading like wildfire. By now, every person at that party had probably told someone else what had happened. And by morning, half the city would know about Abby and Lucas. About me, I could already imagine the phone calls, the awkward conversations. People asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, while secretly feeling relieved that it wasn't happening to them. That's what people did with scandal. They offered sympathy but lapped up the drama at the same time. The question now was, what was I supposed to do next? Divorce. It was the obvious answer, but even that word felt foreign in my mouth. Abby and I had spent over a decade building a life together. It wasn't easy to just walk away from all of it, no matter how much she had hurt me. Our house, our routines, our plans for the future, all of it felt like a cruel joke now. But even if I could somehow forgive her, I knew I could never forget. I couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine when I knew the truth. I grabbed my phone and finally unlocked it. The screen lit up with missed calls and messages, most of them from Abby. Her last text read, "Please come home. I'm sorry." But it was too late to apologize. I stared at the words for a long moment, feeling the weight of them, before turning off the phone again. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind me. I tensed, half expecting Abby to have tracked me down, but when I turned, I saw it was my best friend, Mark. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at me with a mix of concern and hesitation. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Figured I'd find you here." I nodded but didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. Mark leaned against the railing beside me, both of us staring out at the water. "You okay?" I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "I don't know." He didn't push for more, and I was grateful for that. Mark had always been the kind of guy who knew when to talk and when to just be there. Right now, the silence felt like the best option. "I saw the texts," he finally said after a while. "Heard about what happened." Of course, he had. By now, the story was everywhere. I could only imagine the whispers, the speculation. Who knew what Abby was telling people, what Lucas was trying to spin? "You did what you had to do," Mark said. Hell, I would have done the same thing. Probably would have punched Lucas in the face while I was at it. I chuckled, but there wasn't any humor in it. I thought about it. Believe me, we stood there for a few more minutes, the quiet stretching between us. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to be here until Mark showed up. It didn't fix anything, but it helped. You know what comes next, right? He asked. Divorce, I said flatly, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Mark nodded. Yeah, but it's more than that. You've got to figure out how to move forward. Abby screwed up, but you can't let this define the rest of your life. Man, it's gonna hurt, and it's gonna be messy, but you'll get through it. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was just a chapter in my life, not the whole story. But right now, it felt like the pages had been ripped out and burned. I don't even know where to start, I admitted. You start by taking it one day at a time, Mark said, his voice steady. You'll figure it out, and you've got people who'll have your back through all of it. You're not alone. I glanced at him, grateful but still unsure how to even begin moving forward. Everything felt too raw, too fresh. But at least I wasn't completely in the dark. Eventually, we left the pier and I drove back to the house. When I pulled up to the driveway, the lights were still on inside. I could see Abby pacing back and forth through the window, her figure tense, waiting for me to walk through the door. But I didn't. I sat there in the car, staring at the house that had once been my home. The place where we'd built a life. Where we had shared laughter and love, now just a reminder of everything that had fallen apart. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that. But for the first time in hours, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could find a way through the wreckage. And as I finally turned the engine back on and drove away, leaving Abby's silhouette behind me, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, it was time to rebuild my life. On my own terms. The next morning, I woke up in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The room smelled faintly of bleach, and the bed creaked as I rolled over to check the time on my phone. 8 missed calls from Abby. 4 from Lucas. A few from numbers I didn't recognize, probably people from the party wanting to know more, to pry into the mess I had so publicly aired. I wasn't ready to deal with any of it yet. I threw on yesterday's clothes, grabbed a coffee from the diner next door, and headed back to the house. It wasn't because I wanted to see Abby, I didn't, but I knew I couldn't avoid facing the fallout forever. There were things to settle and decisions to make, and I wasn't going to let her control the narrative. As I pulled up to the driveway, my stomach tightened. There was Abby, waiting on the front porch like she'd been standing there all night. Her eyes were red and puffy like she hadn't slept at all, and for a brief second, I felt a pang of sympathy. But then I remembered why we were here in the first place. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my feet as I walked toward her. She didn't say anything at first, just watched me approach, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold it together. We need to talk, she said, her voice shaky. I know. She glanced down at her hands, fumbling with the sleeve of her sweater. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Nate. I swear. I leaned against the porch railing, keeping my distance. You didn't mean for it to happen? So, what, it was just some accident? You didn't mean to lie to me, sneak around with Lucas. Sleep with him? Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes again. It wasn't like that. I don't know, I was confused. Things between us haven't been right for a while, and Stop, I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. Don't turn this around on me. Whatever problems we had, you could have talked to me. You could have told me how you were feeling instead of running off with him. Abby's lip trembled, and she shook her head. I didn't plan this. I didn't plan any of it. It just happened. I scoffed. Right, because cheating just happens. She flinched at my words, and for a moment, the silence between us felt unbearable. I wanted to scream, to yell at her, to let out all the anger that was simmering just beneath the surface. But what was the point? It wouldn't change anything. She made her choices, and now we had to live with them. I never wanted to hurt you, Abby whispered, her voice barely audible. Well, you did, I replied coldly. And now we had to deal with the consequences. Abby wiped at her eyes, nodding slowly. Are you going to file for divorce? I paused, the weight of the question settling over me like a heavy fog. I knew that was the logical next step. There was no going back to how things were before. But hearing her say it out loud made it feel so final, like the door was about to close on everything we had built together. I don't know, I admitted. I need time to figure that out. We stood there for a moment, the distance between us feeling more like miles than feet. Abby looked like she wanted to say something more, but instead, she just nodded again, accepting the reality of the situation. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. I turned and walked back to my car, leaving her standing on the porch, tears streaming down her face. There was nothing more to say. I spent the next week living in a limbo I hadn't expected. Friends reached out, and family too, but I couldn't bring myself to answer most of them. Mark checked in regularly, dragging me out of my motel room when the silence got too loud. He understood I needed space, but he also knew when to step in, to make sure I didn't drown in my own thoughts. In moments of clarity, I tried to sort out my options. Divorce was obvious, but that came with a million other complications: our house, our finances, our lives so deeply intertwined. But it wasn't just the practical side that made it hard, it was the emotional wreckage. A decade together wasn't something I could just erase, no matter how much I wanted to. One evening, Mark and I were sitting at a bar, nursing beers and trying to avoid the subject that hung between us like a shadow. But eventually, he brought it up. "You've got to make a move soon, man," Mark said, his tone gentle but firm. "Staying in this motel and avoiding Abby isn't gonna solve anything. What's your plan?" I took a long sip of my drink, staring at the amber liquid as if it held the answers. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hoarse. "Part of me wants to divorce her and never look back. But then there's this other part of me that's, I don't know, stuck. Like I can't just walk away from everything." Mark nodded, taking in my words. "It's normal to feel that way. It's not easy to let go of something that's been your life for so long. But you have to decide what's best for you now. Not for her, not for anyone else. Just you." I set the glass down, the clink of it hitting the bar echoing in the quiet space between us. "It's not just about me, though. It's about who I'll be if I stay with her. I can't just pretend like nothing happened. But the idea of starting over." "You won't be starting over," Mark said. "You'll be rebuilding. There's a difference." His words lingered in the air, and I knew he was right. Staying with Abby wouldn't bring me peace. It would just be dragging the pain out longer, forcing me to live with the constant reminder of her betrayal. And as much as I hated the thought of a divorce, I hated the idea of living a lie even more. Later that night, back in my motel room, I stared at the divorce papers I had printed out but never signed. They sat there on the small table by the bed, a looming presence in the room. Every time I looked at them, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. But Mark's words echoed in my head: "You'll be rebuilding. There's a difference." The thought of starting over still terrified me, but for the first time since the party, I started to believe that maybe I could do it. Maybe I could rebuild. Maybe there was a life for me beyond Abby. Beyond the betrayal. I grabbed a pen from the bedside table, holding it in my hand for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, deliberately, I signed my name at the bottom of the papers. It wasn't the ending I wanted, but it was the one I needed. As I folded the papers and placed them in an envelope, ready to send them off in the morning, a strange sense of calm settled over me. It wasn't relief exactly, but it was something close. The first step had been taken. The road ahead wasn't clear. But at least I knew I was moving forward. Away from the past, away from Abby, and toward whatever came next. The next morning, I dropped the envelope with the divorce papers into the mailbox. The finality of it hit me harder than I expected. I stood there for a moment, staring at the box, half expecting some part of me to second-guess the decision, to reach in and pull the papers back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Walking away from the mailbox, I felt lighter, but the weight of the past weeks still clung to me. My entire life had shifted, but the world around me kept moving like nothing had changed. People went to work, kids played in the park. It was like I was standing still while everything else moved forward. I drove back to the house one last time to gather my things. Abby wasn't there, thankfully. I wasn't ready for another confrontation, another round of apologies and excuses. The house felt different now, like a hollow shell of what it used to be. I wandered from room to room, picking up small items that had once held meaning. The photo of us on our wedding day, the framed picture of our first home, the silly mementos from vacations we'd taken together. I realized I didn't want any of it. Those things no longer represented happy memories, they were just reminders of what had been destroyed. I left the photos on the shelf, took a deep breath, and walked out the door, closing that chapter of my life behind me. A few days later, I found myself back at the pier, the same place I had gone after the party. This time, though, it didn't feel like I was running away. It felt like I was confronting something, myself, maybe. The wind whipped at my face, the salty air filling my lungs as I leaned against the railing, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. I had come here to think, to figure out what I wanted from life now that everything had changed. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I needed to let go. Let go of the anger, the betrayal, the pain. I had spent weeks consumed by Abby's affair, by the wreckage it left in its wake. And while I knew it would never truly leave me, I also knew that holding onto it was only hurting me. Mark had been right. This wasn't the end, it was a rebuilding. As I stood there, watching the horizon, I made a promise to myself. I would move forward. I didn't know what the future held, but I couldn't stay stuck in the past anymore. Abby had made her choice, and now I was making mine. I left the pier that day with a sense of closure I hadn't expected. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Weeks passed, and life slowly began to take on a new shape. I found a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy but enough to make it feel like my own space. The first night I slept there, surrounded by unpacked boxes, I felt a strange mixture of loneliness and freedom. For the first time in years, I was on my own. No Abby, no shared routines, no familiar comforts. It was terrifying and exhilarating. Mark came over the next day to help me set up. We moved furniture around, hung a few pictures, and drank beers while making jokes about how empty the place still looked. But even in its bareness, it felt good. It felt like mine. "You're gonna be all right, you know that?" Mark said, looking around the apartment with a nod of approval. "Yeah, I think I will be," I replied, feeling the truth of the words sink in. We talked about everything and nothing, avoiding the topic of Abby and the divorce, which had become a silent agreement between us. Mark knew when I needed space, and I appreciated that more than I could say. The more time I spent in my new place, the more I began to embrace this new chapter of my life. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and spending extra hours at the office. It wasn't that I was avoiding my personal life, but rather that I was finding comfort in routine, in having something to focus on other than my failed marriage. But rebuilding wasn't just about work. It was about finding parts of myself I had forgotten. I started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done in years. Ironically, the very place where Abby's affair had started became a source of healing for me. It was different now, though. It wasn't about revenge or anger, it was about taking care of myself. About rebuilding my strength, physically and mentally. One night after a workout, I ran into Lucas, the personal trainer who had shattered my marriage. We hadn't spoken since the night of the party, and seeing him now, face to face, brought back a rush of emotions I wasn't prepared for. He approached me awkwardly like he wasn't sure if I'd punch him in the face or walk away. "Nate," he started, his voice cautious. I stared at him, the guy who had taken something from me without a second thought. But instead of the anger I expected to feel, I found myself oddly calm. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. I'm sorry," he said, his words tumbling out. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't mean for it to happen? What's your excuse?" Lucas shifted uncomfortably, guilt flashing across his face. "I know I screwed up. I know what I did was wrong. I wanted to apologize." I looked at him, the guy who had wrecked my marriage, standing there looking for some kind of absolution. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need anything from him. Not an apology, not an explanation. I didn't need his guilt or his regret. I didn't need anything from him, because I had already let go. "Apology accepted," I said, surprising even myself. "But don't think that changes anything." Lucas nodded, clearly relieved but still uncertain. "Thank you," he muttered before turning and walking away. As he disappeared out the door, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I hadn't expected that encounter to end the way it did, but I was glad for it. I didn't forgive him, not really. But I didn't need to hold on to the anger anymore. It was freeing in a way I hadn't anticipated. Later that night, as I lay in bed in my new apartment, I realized something important. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward. I wasn't healed completely, not by a long shot, but I was no longer stuck in the pain of the past. I was rebuilding, just like Mark had said I would. And this time, I was doing it on my own terms. Life, as it tends to do, kept moving forward. In the weeks after my encounter with Lucas, I found myself growing more comfortable in my new reality. It wasn't perfect, and I still had moments when the weight of everything hit me all at once, but those moments were becoming smaller and further apart. I was getting used to being on my own, carving out a life that no longer revolved around Abby or the betrayal that had defined the last few months. One Saturday morning, I found myself sitting at a local coffee shop, something I hadn't done in years. I used to come here with Abby when we first started dating. Back then, everything had felt so simple, so hopeful. But now, as I sipped my coffee and watched the world pass by outside the window, I realized I was ready to let go of that version of the past too. While scrolling through my phone, I got a notification from a dating app I had downloaded on a whim a few days earlier. I had no real intention of using it, but Mark had convinced me that it was time to put myself out there again, to see what's out there, as he put it. I'd brushed him off at first, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the app to see a message from someone named Caroline. Her profile picture showed a bright smile and messy brown hair, the kind that made her look both carefree and grounded at the same time. I hesitated for a moment before responding with something casual, a simple hello, not wanting to overthink it. To my surprise, she replied almost instantly, and before I knew it, we were deep in conversation, talking about everything from our favorite movies to the best hiking trails in the area. It was refreshing to talk to someone new, someone who had no ties to my old life. Caroline didn't know anything about Abby or the mess I'd been through. She didn't know me as the guy who got cheated on or the guy who threw that infamous party. She just knew me as Nate, and that was enough. After a few days of chatting, we made plans to meet up for dinner. I was nervous, more nervous than I'd expected, but excited too. It felt like a step forward, a way to finally put the past behind me and start building something new. The night of our date, I found myself standing outside the restaurant, checking my phone for the time, then glancing at the door. Caroline arrived right on time, her smile just as warm in person as it had been in her photos. She waved as she approached, and instantly, I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. "Nate?" she asked, her voice bright. "That's me," I said, smiling back. We walked inside, and the evening unfolded better than I could have hoped. Conversation flowed easily between us. Laughter filling the space as we traded stories about awkward first dates, bad job interviews, and embarrassing childhood moments. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Abby or the pain she'd caused. I wasn't carrying the weight of that betrayal with me. I was just present, enjoying the company of someone who made me feel alive again. At the end of the night, as we walked out of the restaurant, Caroline turned to me with a grin. "This was fun. We should do it again sometime." "Definitely," I replied, feeling a genuine sense of happiness I hadn't experienced in months. As I watched her walk away, I realized something important. I was ready for this. Ready for new connections, new experiences, and maybe even new love. I wasn't the same person I had been before Abby's betrayal, but that was okay. I was stronger now, wiser. I was ready to rebuild. A few weeks after my date with Caroline, I got an unexpected message from Abby. It was simple and to the point. "Can we talk?" Part of me wanted to ignore it. I had already moved on in so many ways, signing the divorce papers, finding my own place, going on that date with Caroline. But there was another part of me that knew I couldn't fully close the door on the past without confronting Abby one last time. We agreed to meet at a cafe near our old neighborhood, a place we'd gone to a few times back when things between us were good. As I walked in, I spotted her immediately. She looked different, like the weight of everything had taken its toll on her too. Her hair was pulled back, her expression tired, and her eyes held a sadness I hadn't seen before. "Nate," she said softly as I sat down. "Abby." There was a long, awkward pause. Neither of us seemed to know how to start the conversation. Eventually, Abby broke the silence. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her voice quiet. "About everything. About us. And I need to apologize. Really apologize." I stayed quiet, letting her continue. "I was selfish," she admitted. "I let my own insecurities, my own issues, get in the way of what we had. And I know I can't undo what I did. I know I hurt you in ways I'll never be able to fix. But I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." I looked at her, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, but also closure. This wasn't the same Abby who had lied to my face, who had betrayed me with Lucas. This was someone who had been broken by her own choices, someone who was finally taking responsibility for the pain she had caused. "I appreciate that," I said after a moment. "But this isn't just about an apology. You made your choices, and I've had to deal with the consequences." "We both have." Abby nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. And I don't expect anything from you. I wanted to try to make things right. Even if that just means you can move on without hating me. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I don't hate you, Abby. I did, for a while. But now, I just want to move on. I'm not saying I can forget what happened. But I'm not going to carry that anger with me anymore. She wiped at her eyes, looking both relieved and heartbroken at the same time. Thank you, she whispered. There was another long pause, and this time, it didn't feel as heavy. It felt like the air between us was finally clearing, like the storm we had been trapped in for months was starting to pass. So what now? She asked quietly. I shrugged, glancing out the window at the people passing by on the street. Now, we move on. You go your way, and I'll go mine. I've already started. Abby smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm glad. You deserve to be happy, Nate. I hope you find happiness too, I said, meaning it. We sat there for a few more minutes, exchanging polite conversation, but it was clear that this was the end of the road for us. When we finally stood to leave, I didn't feel the weight of the past clinging to me anymore. I had faced Abby, heard her apology, and now I was free to move forward. As I walked away from the cafe, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I wasn't defined by my past anymore. I wasn't the man who had been betrayed, the man who had thrown a public accusation at a party. I was just Nate, a guy rebuilding his life, one step at a time. And this time, I was ready for whatever came next. It had been nearly 6 months since I last saw Abby, and life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The once chaotic whirlpool of emotions, betrayal, anger, grief, had calmed, leaving behind a stillness I hadn't thought possible. Every day felt like a step further away from the man I had been and closer to the man I wanted to become. Caroline and I were seeing each other more often now. What started as a casual connection turned into something deeper. She had this way of grounding me, of making me feel like the mess I had gone through was just a chapter in a longer story. It wasn't that she filled a void Abby left behind, it was that with her, there was no void. Just a steady warmth that I hadn't realized I needed. We spent weekends hiking, trying out new restaurants, and even just watching movies at my place. Caroline wasn't like Abby in the ways that mattered. She didn't need grand gestures or constant reassurances. She was confident in who she was, and for the first time in a long time, I felt confident in who I was with her. But even with everything going well, there were moments, fleeting, but still present, where I'd find myself thinking about the past. It wasn't that I missed Abby, but more that I wondered how differently things could have turned out. Could we have salvaged our marriage if I had handled things differently? Would we have been happier if I had caught on to her affair sooner? One evening, Caroline and I sat together on the couch, sharing a bottle of wine after dinner. The conversation drifted to past relationships, something we hadn't really delved into before. I know about Abby, she said softly as if reading my mind. You've mentioned her in passing. But I never asked for details because, well, it's your past. But if you want to talk about it, I'm here. I studied her face, her calm expression, and took a deep breath. I wasn't sure I wanted to dredge it all up again, but at the same time, maybe this was part of my healing. Part of moving on. She wasn't always the person who cheated on me, I began, staring down at my wine glass. We had years of good times. We were happy. Or at least, I thought we were. But somewhere along the way, things started to fall apart. And then Lucas happened. Caroline reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. It must have been awful. It was. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. It was realizing how blind I'd been. How I missed all the signs. How she let it go on, right in front of me. I paused, feeling the familiar sting of old wounds reopening. But Caroline's steady gaze reassured me. She wasn't judging. She wasn't waiting to swoop in with platitudes. She just listened. And when I found out, I lost it, I admitted. The way I handled it, throwing that party, exposing her and Lucas in front of everyone, it was brutal. And it felt good at the time, like I was reclaiming some kind of power. But afterward, Caroline nodded, understanding. It didn't fix anything. No, I said, my voice softer now. It didn't. It just left a mess for both of us. There was a long silence between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are processing something big. Something that needs time. Finally, Caroline spoke. I'm glad you told me. And for what it's worth, I think it's okay that you handled things the way you did. You were hurt, betrayed. People react to pain differently, and you did what you needed to at that moment. I looked at her, feeling an immense sense of gratitude. Caroline wasn't offering forgiveness for Abby or excuses for me. She was just offering understanding, and that was more valuable than I could have hoped for. I don't know what the future holds, I said, my voice steady. But I know I'm ready for it now. Whatever comes next. Caroline smiled, her eyes soft. So am I. The weeks that followed were filled with a sense of quiet contentment. My life had reached a new normal. Work was going well. My relationship with Caroline was growing stronger, and I felt like I was finally in control of my future. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk at work, I received a call from Mark. We hadn't talked in a few days, and I could tell from his voice that something was up. "Nate, I need to tell you something," he said, his tone serious. "It's about Abby." Immediately, my stomach tightened. Though I had moved on in many ways, hearing her name still had the power to stir up emotions I didn't want to revisit. "What about her?" I asked cautiously. "She's moving out of town," Mark replied. "She's taking a job in Seattle. I just thought you'd want to know." I sat there, processing the news. It was strange. The idea of Abby moving away, out of my orbit completely, felt surreal. For so long, she had been a part of my life, even after the divorce. But now, with her leaving, it felt like a final chapter was closing. "I guess that's a good thing," I said slowly, more to myself than to Mark. "It's a clean break." "That's what I thought too," Mark said. "I just didn't want you to hear it from someone else." "Thanks, man," I said. "I appreciate it." After we hung up, I found myself thinking about Abby again, but this time, there was no bitterness. No lingering pain, just a sense of closure. Her leaving town was symbolic in a way. It meant that both of us could finally let go of what had happened. There would be no more awkward run-ins, no more wondering how she was doing or what she was up to. That evening, I told Caroline about Abby's move. She listened quietly, nodding as I spoke. "I think this is a good thing," I said. "For both of us." Caroline smiled, her eyes reflecting the peace I felt. "I agree. It's the final step in closing that chapter." And it was. As Abby moved on with her life, I could fully move on with mine. No more ghosts from the past haunting my present. No more wondering if I had done everything I could. The book on my marriage was finally closed, and it was time to focus on what came next. A few days later, Caroline and I went for a walk along the waterfront. The sun was setting, casting the sky in a warm golden glow. We strolled side by side, talking about everything and nothing, the kind of comfortable conversation that only happens when two people are truly at ease with each other. As we reached the end of the pier, Caroline stopped and turned to me. "I'm glad we met, Nate," she said, her voice soft. "I know you've been through a lot, but I think we're building something good here." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words. "We are, and I'm ready for it." We stood there for a while, watching the waves crash against the shore, the future stretching out before us. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't worried about what was ahead. I wasn't haunted by the past or weighed down by old regrets. I was just here, in the moment, with someone who made me feel whole again. And that, I realized, was all I needed. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my apartment as I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee. It was a peaceful Saturday, quiet, unhurried. The kind of morning I had come to appreciate more in recent months. As I watched the steam rise from the cup, I reflected on how much had changed. Life had this strange way of giving you exactly what you needed, even when you didn't realize it. Caroline was due to come over later. We hadn't made any grand plans for the day. Just a lazy afternoon, maybe a walk around the neighborhood, followed by dinner at one of our favorite spots. It felt comfortable. Natural. Nothing forced or frantic, just the slow building of something meaningful. I glanced around my apartment. It wasn't the spacious home I had once shared with Abby, but it was mine. It felt like an extension of who I had become, a place that reflected my new life. The framed photos on the wall were of new memories, new faces, and new experiences. The old pieces of my life, the remnants of the marriage I had once fought to hold onto, were gone now. Everything felt lighter. As I sat there, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Caroline, on my way. "Want to grab breakfast at the cafe instead of cooking?" I smiled and replied, "Sounds perfect. See you soon." Her presence in my life had been transformative, but it wasn't just about her. It was about me too. About the way I had grown and learned to accept that not everything had to be fought for. And not every wound had to leave a scar. I could heal. I could move on. I thought back to the night of the party, to the moment I had publicly confronted Abby and Lucas. At the time, it had felt like the right thing to do, the only way to reclaim my dignity and power. But now, looking back, I realized it wasn't the revenge that had set me free. It was the journey that followed. It was the slow process of rebuilding myself, piece by piece, learning to live without the bitterness that had once consumed me. Abby was gone now, not just from my life, but from the city. Mark had told me she was settling into her new job in Seattle, and that she seemed to be doing okay. I hadn't heard from her since our last conversation at the cafe, and I was fine with that. There was no need for closure beyond what we had already exchanged. We were done, and that was enough. A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. I stood up, crossing the room to open it, and there was Caroline, smiling brightly as always. "Hey," she said, stepping inside and giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Ready to go?" "Absolutely," I replied, grabbing my jacket. "I'm starving." We headed out into the crisp morning air, walking side by side down the familiar streets. The cafe was only a few blocks away, and as we walked, we fell into easy conversation. Caroline told me about her week at work, and I shared a few stories from mine. It was normal, routine, but there was something comforting in that. We didn't need drama or fireworks. We had each other, and that was enough. As we approached the cafe, I saw a familiar face sitting at one of the outdoor tables. It was Mark, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up as we approached, grinning when he saw us. Well, if it isn't the happy couple," he teased, standing up to greet us. "Hey, man," I said, giving him a quick hug. "What are you doing here so early?" "Couldn't sleep," Mark replied, shrugging. "Figured I'd come to grab some breakfast and get a jump on the day." "You two joining me, or do you need a romantic table for two?" Caroline laughed, shaking her head. "You're welcome to join us." We grabbed a table together, and the three of us spent the next hour talking, laughing, and enjoying the easy company. It felt good, sitting there with two people who had come to mean so much to me. One, an old friend who had stood by me through thick and thin, and the other, a new love who had helped me rediscover parts of myself I thought were lost. At some point during the meal, I found myself glancing around the cafe, taking in the scene. The clinking of coffee cups, the murmur of conversation, the smell of freshly baked pastries. It all felt like a world away from the chaos of the past. The anger, the betrayal, the public humiliation, it was all behind me now. I was in a new chapter, one where I didn't have to carry the weight of old wounds. As we finished breakfast, Caroline leaned over and whispered, "You okay? You seem deep in thought." I smiled at her, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Yeah, I'm good. Just happy." She squeezed my hand, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "Me too." As we left the cafe, I knew that the path ahead wouldn't always be smooth. Life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't worried about what was coming next. I wasn't holding on to the past or waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was here, in the moment, with people who cared about me. And that was enough. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting everything that had happened. It didn't mean pretending the pain wasn't real. But it did mean letting go of the need to control everything, of the idea that closure came from vengeance or retribution. Closure came from within, from accepting that life moves on, that people grow and change, and that happiness can be found in the most unexpected places. And as I walked down the street, hand in hand with Caroline, I knew that I had finally found mine. It had been a few months since Abby moved to Seattle, and I barely thought about her anymore. My life with Caroline was unfolding in the best way possible. Every day felt like a step forward, a life of stability and small moments of joy that I hadn't known I needed. The chaos, the betrayal, and the anger were memories fading in the rearview mirror. But as life likes to remind you, the past never really stays in the past. It was a sunny Saturday, and Caroline and I had planned to go to an art exhibit in the city. We were walking through the gallery, admiring the abstract pieces, when I heard someone say my name. "Nate?" I turned toward the voice, and my heart skipped a beat. There, standing a few feet away, was Abby. She looked different, her hair shorter, her expression softer, but there was no mistaking her. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other in awkward silence. Caroline must have sensed the tension. She gave my hand a quick squeeze and said softly, "I'll go grab us some coffee." "Okay?" I nodded, grateful for her understanding. As Caroline walked away, Abby took a step forward, her hands nervously fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "It's been a while," she said, her voice cautious. "Yeah, it has," I replied, still unsure how to feel. I had imagined running into Abby at some point, but I hadn't expected it to happen like this. So out of the blue, in the middle of what had been a perfectly peaceful day. "You look good," Abby offered, her eyes scanning my face. "How have you been?" "Good," I said, nodding. "Really good, actually. And you?" She gave a small smile. "I'm doing better. Seattle's been a fresh start for me." The conversation felt stilted, like we were tiptoeing around the weight of everything that had happened. There was no animosity between us anymore, but there was still history. A heavy one. Abby shifted her weight, looking like she was about to say something important. "I know this is weird, but I'm glad we ran into each other. I've been meaning to reach out, but I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do." I raised an eyebrow. "Reach out about what?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I wanted to apologize again. For everything. I know we talked after the divorce, but I don't think I ever truly expressed how sorry I am for what I did. For how I hurt you." I stood there, absorbing her words. It wasn't like I had heard her apology before, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was because I wasn't carrying the same anger anymore. Maybe it was because I had truly moved on. "I appreciate that, Abby," I said, my voice calm. "I've come a long way since then. We both have, I think." She smiled, a mix of relief and sadness in her expression. "Yeah, I guess we have." There was a long pause, the kind that could either end the conversation or invite more. But I had nothing left to say. I didn't need anything from her anymore, not closure, not validation, not even an apology. I had found all of that on my own. "Well," I said, taking a step back, "I should probably get back to Caroline." Abby glanced over at Caroline, who was sitting at a nearby cafe table, watching us from a distance with a warm, supportive smile. "She seems nice," Abby said softly. "She is," I replied, my chest swelling with pride. "She really is." Abby nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm happy for you, Nate. Truly." "Thanks," I said, meaning it. We exchanged a few more pleasantries before parting ways. As I walked back to Caroline, I felt lighter than I had in years. There was no longer any lingering tension between Abby and me, no unfinished business or unspoken resentment. Just two people who had gone through something painful and come out the other side. Caroline smiled up at me as I sat down across from her. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, taking her hand in mine. "Everything's fine." That unexpected encounter with Abby was like the final nail in the coffin of my past. After seeing her, I realized just how much I had changed, how far I had come from the man I once was. I wasn't defined by the betrayal anymore, or by the revenge I had sought. I wasn't the guy stuck in a loop of anger and regret. I was someone else now, someone stronger, happier, and more in control of his life. A few weeks after running into Abby, Caroline and I were having dinner at my apartment. It was one of those cozy nights in which the outside world didn't matter. We had cooked together and laughed together. And now we sat side by side on the couch, watching the city lights twinkle through the windows. Caroline was quiet, almost pensive, and I could tell something was on her mind. After a few moments, she turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "Nate," she began, her voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot lately about us." I felt my heart skip, wondering where this was going. "What about us?" She smiled, a little nervously. "I love what we have, and I love being with you. But I've been thinking about the future. Where we're headed." I sat up a little straighter, my heart rate picking up. "You mean, moving in together? That kind of thing?" Caroline nodded. "Yeah, something like that. But I've also been offered a promotion at work, and it would require me to move to Portland." The words hung in the air for a moment, and I felt my stomach drop. Portland. It wasn't that far, but it was far enough to complicate things. "I didn't accept it yet," she said quickly, reading the look on my face. "Because I wanted to talk to you first. I don't want to do long distance, Nate. I've done that before, and it's hard. But I also don't want to rush things between us." I stared at her, processing everything. This was a crossroads, the kind that forced you to confront what you really wanted. Did I see a future with Caroline that was worth making big decisions for? Or was this just another chapter that would eventually close? "I don't want to lose you," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. Caroline smiled, her eyes softening. "You won't, but we need to figure out what's next." There was a long pause as I thought about it, about everything we had been through and what the future could look like. And then, the decision felt clear. I didn't want to live in fear of the unknown, of what might happen. I didn't want to lose something good because I was too scared to take the next step. Portland's not that far, I said, my voice steady. And if this promotion is important to you, you should take it. We'll figure it out. Caroline's face lit up, her smile wide and genuine. Are you sure? Absolutely, I said, pulling her closer. We'll make it work. I believe in us. Caroline leaned in, kissing me softly, and at that moment, I knew I was making the right choice. Life was unpredictable, but we were both committed to seeing where this relationship could go. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was looking ahead at a future that wasn't overshadowed by the past. It was a fresh start, a new horizon that we were about to explore together. We spent the rest of the evening talking about the logistics, what the move would look like, how often we'd visit each other, and what our next steps might be. It wasn't going to be easy, but it wasn't impossible either. And more than anything, I felt a sense of calm, a sense that no matter what challenges came our way, we'd face them together. As the night wore on, we settled back onto the couch, her head resting on my shoulder, our hands intertwined. The city lights twinkled outside. And for the first time in years, I wasn't worried about what was coming next. I was ready for whatever life had in store, as long as I had Caroline by my side. The past was behind me, and the future? Well, it was wide open. The following weeks passed in a blur of packing boxes, phone calls, and planning. Caroline accepted the promotion, and the countdown to her move to Portland had begun. Every day was filled with anticipation, excitement, and a hint of nervousness about how things would change once the distance became real. But through it all, we were solid. Our relationship had taken root in something deeper: trust, honesty, and a commitment to make this work. There was no more second-guessing, no more lingering shadows of the past. I was all in. On Caroline's last weekend before the move, we decided to spend it at a cabin just outside the city, a quiet retreat to soak up the time together before our new chapter began. It was a place we had gone a few times before, nestled in the woods with a small lake nearby. We'd spent countless afternoons here, talking about life and enjoying the peace away from the world. The sun had just begun to set, casting golden hues over the water as we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets and sipping wine. The air was cool, but it was perfect, quiet, serene, and just what we needed. Are you nervous? I asked, breaking the silence. Caroline looked at me, her eyes thoughtful. A little, she admitted. But I'm also excited. It's a new opportunity, a fresh start. And I feel like I'm ready for it. I nodded, understanding completely. We were both in this place of renewal, leaving behind old wounds and embracing the possibility of something better. What about you? She asked, leaning closer. Do you feel okay about all of this? I took a deep breath, considering her question. Yeah, I do. I'm not scared of what's coming anymore. It's different this time. I don't feel like I'm losing something. I feel like I'm gaining something, a future with you. Caroline smiled, her eyes softening. I feel the same way. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to a deep, dusky purple. It was one of those moments that felt like it belonged in a different time, a place where everything just stood still, and you could breathe, completely content. Eventually, I turned to her, my heart pounding a little faster. There was something I had been thinking about for a while, something I hadn't said yet but knew it was time. Caroline, I began, my voice steady, I know we've talked about the future a lot. And I know you're about to start this new journey in Portland, and we'll figure out how to make it work. But there's something I need to say before you go. She looked at me curiously, her eyes searching mine. I love you, I said, the words feeling so natural, so right. I know we've been through a lot in a short time, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I want to be with you, no matter where you are. Caroline's eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw the emotion ripple through her. She set her wine glass down and turned fully to face me, her hand gently resting on my arm. I love you too, Nate, she whispered, her voice soft but firm. I've known for a while now, and hearing you say it makes everything feel even more real. We leaned in at the same time, our lips meeting in a kiss that felt like the culmination of everything we had been through. The highs, the lows, the fears. And the triumphs. It was a kiss that sealed our promise to one another, that no matter what life threw at us, we would face it together. When we pulled away, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Not just because of the love we shared, but because of the man I had become in the process. I wasn't the same person who had been consumed by revenge and anger. I had let go of that man and embraced a new version of myself, someone who was open to love, to healing, and to the future. The next morning, as we packed up the cabin and headed back to the city, there was no sadness in our goodbye. Caroline would be leaving for Portland in just a few days, but the distance didn't feel like a threat. It felt like another step in our journey, a challenge we were ready to face head-on. As we pulled up to her apartment and unloaded the bags, Caroline turned to me with a playful smile. "You know," she said, "there's always a guest room in Portland if you ever get tired of this city." I laughed, pulling her into a hug. "I'll take you up on that offer. Don't be surprised if I show up with a suitcase." "I'd love that," she whispered, her arms wrapped tightly around me. That night, after I dropped her off, I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for my relationship with Caroline, but for everything that lay ahead. There would be challenges, no doubt. But for the first time in years, I was ready to face them. I wasn't running from the past anymore. I wasn't looking back at the mistakes and the heartbreak that had once defined me. I was looking forward, to a new chapter, a new beginning, and a life I had built for myself. And no matter what came next, I knew I wasn't alone. Caroline was part of my future now, and together, we'd write the next pages of our story. A story that wasn't about betrayal or revenge, but about love, growth, and the promise of what was still to come.